Annette was a kind-hearted girl, known throughout her neighborhood for always helping those in need. She lived with her grandmother, who had raised her since she was a little girl after her parents passed away. Annette loved her grandmother dearly and had learned the values of kindness and generosity from her. One sunny afternoon, as Annette was walking home from school, she noticed an elderly woman struggling with several bags of groceries. The woman looked tired and was having a hard time carrying everything. Without a second thought, Annette approached her with a warm smile. "Do you need some help, ma'am?" Annette asked, gently taking one of the heavier bags from the woman. The elderly woman, Mrs. Jane, looked up at Annette with surprise and relief. "Oh, thank you, dear. These old arms aren't what they used to be," she said with a grateful smile. As they walked together, Annette and Mrs. Jane started chatting. Mrs. Jane told Annette about her late husband, how she lived alone now, and how things had become more difficult for her as she got older. Annette listened intently, feeling a deep sense of empathy for the woman. When they arrived at Mrs. Jane's house, a modest little home with a well-kept garden, Annette helped her carry the groceries inside. As they unpacked the bags, Mrs. Jane sighed. "I wish I could thank you properly, Annette," she said, "but all I can offer is some tea. I don't have much, you know." Annette shook her head. "There's no need to thank me, Mrs. Jane. I'm happy to help." As they sat down for tea, Mrs. Jane mentioned how her television had suddenly stopped working the night before. She spoke about how it was her only real source of company in the evenings and how lonely she felt without it. "My eyes aren't as sharp as they used to be," Mrs. Jane admitted, "and I'm not very good with all those buttons and wires. I was planning on calling someone to come and fix it, but I'm not sure who to trust." Annette's face lit up with an idea. "I could come by tomorrow and take a look at it for you, Mrs. Jane. I'm pretty good with electronics, and it might be something simple." Mrs. Jane's eyes sparkled with hope. "Oh, Annette, that would be wonderful. You're such a kind soul." The next day after school, Annette made her way back to Mrs. Jane's house. She brought a small toolkit with her, just in case. Mrs. Jane welcomed her warmly, and they went straight to the living room where the old television sat lifeless. Annette got to work checking the cables and connections. It didn't take long for her to find the problem. A loose wire at the back of the TV. She carefully reconnected it, and to Mrs. Jane's delight, the TV flickered back to life. "Oh, thank you, Annette," Mrs. Jane exclaimed, clapping her hands together in joy. "You've made this old woman very happy today." Annette smiled, feeling a warm glow of satisfaction. "I'm glad I could help," she said. Before she left, Mrs. Jane gave Annette a tight hug. "You're a blessing, dear. Your grandmother must be so proud of you." Annette blushed and hugged her back. "It was nothing, Mrs. Jane. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." As Annette walked home, she felt good about helping Mrs. Jane. Little did she know, this simple act of kindness would lead to something she never could have imagined. The next morning, Annette woke up feeling happy, looking forward to another day at school. But as she was getting ready, there was a knock at the door. Her grandmother answered it, and Annette heard voices. One of them unfamiliar. Curiosity piqued, she went to the door and froze in shock. Standing on their doorstep was Mrs. Jane, but she wasn't alone. Beside her was a stern-looking police officer, his hand resting on the radio at his waist. Mrs. Jane's face was pale, and she seemed anxious, but the officer's expression was unreadable. Annette's heart raced. What was going on? She had no idea that the events of the previous day were about to turn her world upside down. Annette stood frozen at the sight of the police officer on her doorstep, her mind racing with questions. Why was Mrs. Jane here with a cop? Had something happened? Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and confusion taking over. "Annette," her grandmother called gently, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Come here, sweetheart." Annette hesitantly stepped forward, her eyes darting between Mrs. Jane and the officer. Mrs. Jane looked as if she hadn't slept all night, her face lined with worry. Annette's stomach churned. She couldn't imagine what could have gone wrong. The police officer cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "Are you Annette?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. "Ah, yes." Annette stammered, glancing nervously at Mrs. Jane. "What's going on?" Mrs. Jane stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Annette, I'm so sorry to bother you like this, but after you left yesterday, I couldn't find my jewelry box. I don't want to accuse you, dear, but I didn't know what else to do. I've looked everywhere, and I had to report it to the police." Annette's eyes widened in shock. "Your jewelry box?" "Mrs. Jane, I swear I didn't take anything." Her grandmother's hand gently rested on her shoulder, offering silent support. The officer studied Annette carefully, his expression softening slightly as he noted her genuine surprise and distress. "We're not accusing you of anything, Annette," the officer said calmly, "but we need to follow up on the report. Mrs. Jane just wants to find her missing items." Annette's heart sank. She couldn't believe this was happening. Just yesterday, she had been helping Mrs. Jane out of kindness, and now she was being implicated in a theft. Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled to find her voice. "I didn't take it," Annette repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promise, Mrs. Jane, I didn't touch your jewelry box. I was just there to fix the TV." Mrs. Jane looked at Annette, a mix of doubt and sorrow in her eyes. "I want to believe you, Annette. You've always been such a good girl. But everything happened so quickly after you left, and I didn't know what else to think." The officer nodded understandingly. "Annette, would it be all right if we had a quick look around your house, just to rule out any misunderstandings?" Annette's grandmother spoke up before Annette could respond. "Of course, officer. We have nothing to hide. Please do whatever you need to clear this up." Annette felt the pain of gratitude for her grandmother's unwavering trust. The officer stepped inside and began a careful search, while Mrs. Jane stayed near the doorway, looking deeply troubled. Annette stood silently, clutching her grandmother's hand, praying that this nightmare would end soon. After what felt like an eternity, the officer returned empty-handed. He gave Annette a small nod. "There's nothing here that doesn't belong. Annette, I'm sorry you had to go through this, but we had to be thorough." Relief flooded Annette, but it was quickly overshadowed by a lingering hurt. She turned to Mrs. Jane, her eyes filled with sadness. "I would never steal from you, Mrs. Jane. I thought we were friends." Mrs. Jane's eyes filled with tears as she realized the pain she had caused this kind girl who had only tried to help her. "Oh, Annette, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I was so scared and confused, and I jumped to the worst conclusion. Can you ever forgive me?" Annette hesitated, the sting of the accusation still fresh in her heart. But as she looked into Mrs. Jane's remorseful eyes, she remembered all the times her grandmother had taught her about forgiveness and understanding. "I forgive you, Mrs. Jane," Annette said quietly, though her voice wavered. "I just hope you know I would never do something like that." Mrs. Jane nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Annette. I'll keep looking for my jewelry box, and I'll let you know as soon as I find it. I'm so sorry for all of this." The officer offered a polite nod and prepared to leave. As he did, he glanced back at Annette, giving her a look that seemed to carry an unspoken apology. Annette watched him go, feeling a mix of emotions she couldn't quite sort out. As Mrs. Jane and the officer left, Annette closed the door and leaned against it, feeling drained. Her grandmother pulled her into a comforting embrace. "You did the right thing, Annette," she murmured. "You showed grace and kindness, even when you were wronged." Annette nodded, resting her head on her grandmother's shoulder. But as she closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the ordeal. Something still didn't sit right, and she wondered what the next day might bring. That night, sleep didn't come easily for Annette. She kept replaying the events of the day in her mind, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. She had always been taught that kindness was the right path, but now she found herself questioning whether that was true. What if helping others only led to pain and misunderstanding? The next morning, Annette woke up with a heavy heart. She went through her morning routine in a daze, still shaken by the previous day's events. Even as she sat down for breakfast with her grandmother, the food tasted bland and unappetizing. "Annette, sweetheart, you need to eat," her grandmother urged gently, noticing her granddaughter's troubled expression. "You can't let this take you down." Annette forced a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know, Nana. I'm just still thinking about everything. I feel like I did something wrong, even though I didn't." Her grandmother reached across the table and took her hand. "You didn't do anything wrong, Annette. You acted out of kindness, and that's something to be proud of. Sometimes people make mistakes and jump to conclusions, but that doesn't mean you should stop being the good person you are." Annette nodded, taking comfort in her grandmother's words. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. She knew Mrs. Jane felt terrible about accusing her, but the fact that the jewelry box was still missing made her uneasy. It was as if a dark cloud hovered over her, refusing to dissipate. As Annette got ready for school, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat, fearing that it might be more bad news. Her grandmother answered the door, and Annette peeked around the corner to see who it was. To her surprise, it wasn't the police or Mrs. Jane. Instead, it was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with bright eyes and a kind smile. She introduced herself as Emily, Mrs. Jane's niece, who had just flown in from out of town after hearing about the situation. "Hello, I'm Emily. I'm sorry to bother you so early in the morning, but I just arrived and wanted to speak with Annette if possible," Emily said, her tone gentle and sincere. Annette stepped forward cautiously. "I'm Annette. What do you need to talk to me about?" Emily smiled reassuringly. "First, I want to apologize on behalf of my aunt. She's been under a lot of stress lately, and when the jewelry box went missing, she panicked. But I also wanted to let you know that we found the box." Annette's eyes widened in surprise. "You found it? Where was it?" Emily nodded, her expression turning a bit sheepish. "Yes, we found it tucked away in a drawer in the guest room. It seems Auntie had moved it there herself weeks ago and completely forgot. When she couldn't find it, she immediately thought the worst, which is why she ended up calling the police. I'm so sorry for everything you went through." A wave of relief washed over Annette, but it was quickly followed by frustration. So all of this happened because she forgot where she put it? Emily sighed. "I know it's not fair, Annette. My aunt has been struggling with her memory lately, and it's caused a lot of confusion. But I promise you, she never meant to hurt you. She's really sorry." Annette didn't know what to say. She felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that she was no longer suspected of stealing, but also a lingering hurt from the entire ordeal. She looked at Emily, who seemed genuinely sorry for what had happened. "It's okay," Annette said finally, though her voice was tinged with sadness. "I just wish it hadn't come to this." "I understand," Emily replied, "but I'm really glad I got to meet you. Auntie always spoke so highly of you, and now I see why. You have a good heart, Annette." Annette managed a small smile. "Thank you, Emily. I hope Mrs. Jane is feeling better." "She is," Emily assured her. "And she would love to see you again, if you're willing. She feels terrible about everything and wants to make it right." Annette hesitated, but she knew deep down that holding onto anger wouldn't make her feel any better. "I'll come by later," she agreed. "I'd like to talk to her." Emily smiled warmly. "She'll be glad to hear that." "Thank you, Annette." As Emily left, Annette felt a sense of closure slowly beginning to take root. The events of the past few days had been overwhelming, but she knew she couldn't let them change who she was. She would continue to be kind and helpful, no matter how others reacted. Her grandmother was right. Kindness was something to be proud of. Later that day, Annette made her way to Mrs. Jane's house. This time she walked with a little more confidence, knowing that she had done nothing wrong. When she arrived, Mrs. Jane greeted her at the door, her eyes filled with gratitude and apology. "I'm so glad you came, Annette," Mrs. Jane said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry for everything." Annette smiled gently. "It's okay, Mrs. Jane. I understand." As they sat down to talk, the tension that had been between them began to melt away. They shared a cup of tea and talked about everything that had happened, finally clearing the air. By the time Annette left, she felt lighter, knowing that the ordeal was truly behind her. As she walked home, Annette realized that sometimes even the kindest actions could lead to unexpected challenges. But it was how she chose to handle those challenges that mattered most. And in the end, she knew she had stayed true to herself, kind, forgiving, and strong. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue bringing you more heartwarming and inspiring stories. Thank you for being a part of our community.